I never know. Yeah, like I mean, look, I was up early anyway, but I'm always like, better to wake up earlier or just to like have the hours of sleep.
I don't know, to me, I'm up anyway, but I think hydrating water was the most important thing. So we are
Yeah.
open and live.
Yeah, well, we'll let people, they'll make their way in, they'll find a seat, they'll get themselves comfortable.
Oh, anybody else going away for any period of time? You're all here through the winter?
Well, we're talking about heading back to New York, I say, as I'm in New York right now. Um, Welcome everyone. It's so good to be with you all. And this is our last session of the year, not our last session. We have heard from you. You all seem to be enjoying it, and I'm enjoying just chatting with everyone here. So, but our last session of 2021, which is hard to believe. A quick word of housekeeping. There is live transcript available. If you press the button at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says live transcript. We make no promises about how some of the words that we say do get transcribed, but that is something that's available. And Autumn is here for any of your technical needs. So welcome. This is the continuation of our program for Rabbis Unlimited Opinions. I am Rory Pickernese with the Jewish Community Relations Council, and I'm joined by Jim Bennett from Congregation Shar Emeth, and Daniel Bogard from Central Reform Congregation, and Carney Rose from Congregation B'nai Emunah. And all of us have had the privilege of studying with the Hartman Institute. Some of us are in New York because we are continuing our study tomorrow, in fact. And that's what brings me to New York today. And so this is really just a chance for all of us to come together and share both some of our thoughts, some of the learning that we've taken from Hartman, but I would say also some of the skills that we have of how do we engage with one another across lines of difference, sometimes vast difference, sometimes not so vast, but how do we just engage on the topics that really animate us and animate our Jewish lives. So with that, I'm going to pass this to Carney to introduce our topic for today.
Thank you, Maharat Rory, and to my colleagues, Boker Tov. It's nice to see everybody. I guess it's already Tzoraim Tovim. We're already into the afternoon, but great to be with all of you. As we've been moving through these wonderful sessions, and by the way, it's so nice to receive the feedback from so many of you. Please keep those comments coming. Please send them all to Rory. She'll be happy to farm them out to the rest of us. No, please feel free to send them to each of us or any of us, and we will forward them if appropriate.
I'll take all the
the
compliments. Send the
Very
good
good.
ones to me. The complaints go to the rest of them.
Very good, the complaint department. But keep them coming because in many ways, what we're about to start to do over the next few sessions when we gather is in reaction to the questions that you have been asking. And many have asked me in particular, those who've written to me, about how I conceive of Torah. How does Torah animate my life? How does Torah animate my rabbinate? How does Torah itself work for me in the work that I am doing as a leader in the Jewish community? And so I kind of tossed this idea up against the wall and shared it with my dear Chaverim and my teachers and my colleagues. And we decided that each of us would talk a little bit about a text, share a text, and talk a little bit about a text that animates our rabbinate and that animates our personal relationship with Torah and how we utilize Torah to help make meaning in the lives, in our own lives, of course, and in the lives of our families and our congregations and our communities. And so we're going to do a session today on how Torah animates our lives. We'll then get together and have another conversation about how God animates our lives for those of us for whom God is a growing concern or a going concern. And then we're going to do another session, hopefully on the people of Israel. And then ultimately, at least my vision is that we'll do one on humanity, how we see our service to humanity and how Torah and teachings of our people animate our work in all of those various areas. So that's my crazy thinking for today. And I hope that my colleagues will join me in this Mishigas. I'm going to actually start with a wonderful story, if we don't mind, a little maise. There is a wonderful story that is taught by Reb Nachman of Bratza, the story of the tainted wheat. Do you remember this story? And the story is that there's a wonderful king and he has an amazing advisor, and they find out that all the wheat in the kingdom is tainted. And if you eat the wheat, you become crazy. You become epis meshuga, right? You just go crazy. And of course, without the food, people die. And so the king and the advisor get together and they make a deal. Right? And what's the deal? The deal is they're going to eat the wheat and they're going to feed it to everybody. But the king and the advisor are going to put a little mark on their forehead. And the mark on the forehead is an indication that we absolutely know that we are crazy. And even when we eat the wheat and we become Meshuggah, we'll know that we're Meshuggah, and at least we'll remember that what we're doing is Meshuggah. It's wonderful to be working with colleagues who are Epis Meshuggah. They are really crazy for the holy work that they do, and it animates their lives in profound ways. And I hope that the smiles are indicative of their yearning. He's making marks on their forehead. Yeah, that they agree with me, because this work, this notion of talking about what animates or how Torah animates our rabbinates is not something that I think even average rabbis do. And so it's nice to be hanging out with people who are above average, excellent, extraordinary, deep, sensitive teachers of Torah. So with that being said, we're going to hand it over. I don't know if we decided who's going first and who's going last, but maybe it might be good to have somebody else other than me talk for a little while. So whoever's going, we'll let Autumn know. And thank you, Autumn, for putting up whatever material somebody calls out.
I'll be happy to jump in. Autumn, if you could put up the text from Genesis chapter 22. Maybe it's a good place to start because it's an ancient text, comes from the Torah, and it's a place of beginning, I think. And I chose this text not because in any way, shape, or form is this text necessarily my favorite text of Torah, because actually this text, which I'm sure everybody is very familiar with, is the text of Genesis chapter 22, the Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, one of the most studied and debated and argued texts in our Jewish tradition. I didn't choose it because I love it, because actually I find this text very deeply disturbing on so many levels, and yet nonetheless informative. And I chose it because I wanted to remind us of at least one way that Torah can animate our lives and inform all of our work, not just the work of those of us whose, day-to-day work and obligation is to live in Torah, those of us who've chosen lives within Jewish leadership, but all of us as students of Torah and as people who care about and value Torah in our life. The story of the binding of Isaac is, I think, familiar to most. Anybody engaged in Jewish life has heard and read this story. And I don't want to actually take the little time I have here to read all the text, but just to put it in front of us, we know this story. It's a story of Avraham, to whom God appears and calls and says, Avraham, I have a task for you. I want you to take your son, your favorite son, your son Isaac, the one you love, and go to that land that I will show you, the land of Moriah, and there to offer him as a burnt offering. And as the text unfolds, and you could read it on your own, you can look at it later, as the text unfolds, we discover that there is a mystique and also a disturbing evidence of a troubled relationship that unfolds. And Avraham and Yitzchak walk on the way, and Isaac appears in a way to be somewhat oblivious, although he frequently, as explicated by the Midrashic mind, he frequently asks questions that hint that he wonders, Dad, what exactly are we doing? But at the end of the story, we get to the very end of the story, and Autumn, if you can scroll down to the bottom of that page, we see that, that's good. We see that God rewards Avraham for his willingness to offer his son as an offering, and stays his hand and prevents him from having to carry out this act. And Abraham is celebrated by God. By myself, I swear, God says, because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore. And your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants because you have obeyed my command. And Avram returns to his servants, notably without Isaac. And they departed together for Beersheba, and Avram stayed in Beersheba. I wanted to bring this text with all of its complexity and all of its ambivalence for many of us, those of us who say, how could a parent be willing, even willing, to offer a child as a sacrifice, even if I hoped or believed that God would save me? But I want to look at this text through the eyes of the famous philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. So, Autumn, just a little bit more up on the screen. Emmanuel Levinas, thank you so much, Autumn. A little tiny bit more. Let's see if we can get the whole text up here. There we go. So Emmanuel Levinas picks up on the great non-Jewish Dutch philosopher Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, who celebrates the Abraham of the Torah for being, as Kierkegaard calls him, a knight of faith, a heroic figure who trusts so deeply in his faith in God that he is willing to lose himself and to lose all of what makes his life meaningful, just because his faith is the greatest thing of all. And Levinas challenges Kierkegaard, and Levinas offers an alternative reading of Kierkegaard, and I've bolded it in the middle of the text. Levinas says, but one could actually think the opposite, rather than describing the encounter with God as heroic, as rising above, as what Kierkegaard teaches is the teleological suspension of the ethical, the willingness to put everything I thought was right and wrong aside because I have a higher value, my faith in God. Levinas says, but one could think the opposite. Abraham's attentiveness to the voice that led him back to the ethical order and forbidding him to perform a human sacrifice is the highest point of the drama. In other words, instead of, as Kierkegaard suggests, that the highest point of the drama is listening to God's first voice in this story, when God tells him to sacrifice his son, Levinas says maybe the real heroic act is the opposite. Listening to the voice, the quieter voice, the voice of the angel, the voice within Avraham that stops him from suspending what he knows is right and wrong. That's perhaps the most heroic, and as Levinas says, the highest point. That he obeyed the first voice, he says, is astonishing. How could anybody do this? But that he had sufficient distance with respect to that obedience to hear the second voice. That is the essential. I wanted to lift this text up, and you can read the rest of it on your own. And maybe, Autumn, if we can come back to full screen again so we can see each other. I just want to say the reason I chose this text was because this text, especially as read by Levinas, who teaches us in his philosophy, and if you haven't studied Levinas, I encourage everyone to study Levinas. Levinas reminds us of something that I think right now at this moment in history and right now in this nation and right now in our lives is perhaps one of the most important lessons that animates me and my work as a rabbi and as a human being. We have to, as Levinas says, look into the face of the other and remember why we are really here. Just as Avraham listened to God's voice and was willing, incredulously, I might add, I'm incredulous to believe that he was willing to sacrifice his son. He listened even harder, even deeper. And perhaps he was able to listen because he might have looked into the face of his son and realized the humanity and the utter essential nature of the most ethical act. And I'd argue that's what our world needs right now. We need to look at each other's faces, not just through Zoom, but we need to see each other face to face and feel the pain of the other and be called back to our core ethical principle by virtue of that face-to-face experience. So the question posed, what animates your work? This is an example of why Torah and the way we can read Torah with the help of the great philosophers and with our own insights. That animates me, and I hope it animates you as well. So I'll throw it back to my colleagues for comments or reactions, thoughts, deeper thoughts.
So first of all, thank you so much, Rabbi Bennett. Really a beautiful teaching. You know, it's amazing to me that I was ordained in 1995, and was only after my ordination that Levinas seemed to become hot again. I don't know if Levinas was more de rigueur at HUC during your time there? Were people teaching Levinas already? But it seems that there's been a cascade of Levinas that's kind of filtered into the world, which I think is a wonderful gift to all of us.
I have to be honest, Carney, I never even heard of Emmanuel Levinas when I was a rabbinic student. His name was never mentioned and never taught. And it was actually due to one of my beloved uncles of blessed memory, Arnold Bennett, who was a great advocate of Levinas, who said to me once, "Have you ever read Levinas?" And I said, I don't even know who Levinas is. Wow. I was well into my rabbinate. And because he taught this to me, my uncle, who was a brilliant scholar, not a rabbi, just a really smart Jew, a really smart person, he taught me about Levinas. I became obsessed with Levinas and still to this day think that his teaching is critical to my understanding of what it means to be human.
Oh, beautiful. I was going to ask the question, which I think is probably being echoed in the conversations below, the whole notion of what does this actually say, not only about Torah, which I think you've done a beautiful job talking about how it animates your Torah, but what does this story and the way in which Levinas kind of adds his parshanut, his commentary, do for you in terms of God? You were incredulous with the first request on part of God, but the notion that somehow God is obfuscating what it is that God really has in mind for Abraham, and we're really looking for what we might call the deeper Torah or the deeper command from God. Like, is God playing tricks with us? The commandment to sacrifice one's child is hard enough in and of itself, but to know that that really isn't God's intention, but God is playing some kind of game that really God wants you to dig deeper and find out what it is that God really wants. So what do you make of that? How does that help us potentially, as essentially for us as individuals, as teachers of Torah, as students of Torah?
I'll answer quickly, but I'd be curious to hear what you and Daniel and Rory also feel about this. I can just say personally, I don't think God's playing games with us. And I don't know exactly how Levinas would answer that particular specific question, but I believe that what Levinas is calling us to do is to believe our own eyes and our own experience. And I guess to put this in more literal contemporary terms, to trust science and facts and reality, as well as the reality of our own core values. And if something that our faith supposedly calls us to do, or that mistakenly we think our faith calls us to do, whether it's to perform an act that forces us to transgress our most core ethical values, or to support a cause or a nation or a people that we think actually challenges our core ethical values, to say, wait a minute, that cognitive dissonance is there for a reason. It's not that God's tricking us, but maybe we misunderstood the first commandment in the first place. And therefore, it took further relational experience, that face-to-face encounter, very Levinasian or Buberian in nature, that just being in relationship with others reminds us, come on, stop it. And I think about this in all the dialogues we've had, whether it be about Israel and Palestine, or whether it be about American Jewish life. Sometimes it's like, come on, trust your God-given common sense, not what you think or want to claim God is commanding you to do, when you may be corrupting the core essence of that value. But Daniel and Rory, I'd be interested in and Carney, yours as well, your thoughts on that.
I was struck, Jim. First of all, I've never heard this text before, and I so appreciate it. It's really beautiful. I was struck, one of the paragraphs that was in between the bold paragraphs that you read, talked all about Sodom and Gomorrah, and I feel like as Hartman folk, right, this is important. One of the lessons that I very much took from David Hartman of a blessed memory is this way of thinking that says that the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, was actually Abraham's moral failure, and that Sodom and Gomorrah was his moral success story, and that Sodom and Gomorrah is the model of Abraham that we should follow, not the Akedah. I'm also, at least personally, struck by the fact that Abraham is willing to stand up and defend strangers and sacrifice his own child, right? There's something to that too, and how we behave with those closest to us. And but yeah.
Amen. I agree.
So I was, it's funny because I was noticing it recently, because we were just like reading some of these parshiot, and I noticed it's what is it, right in Vayishlach, right? So when Jacob, right, when he is going to encounter his brother Esau again, and he starts to prepare for it, and he sends messengers and he sends gifts and he prays and he does all of the things, right? And he divides his family up into two camps, like to prepare for battle. So the prayer, like what he does is, right, he turns to God, and what really struck me is that Jacob says to God exactly what Abraham should have said to God, which is what he says is, God, you promised I was going to be a great nation. You have to protect my family right now, right? Which is like, Jacob, at least, I mean, at the risk of being really crass, right? Jacob divides his family. He's got 6 sons here and 6 sons here, or 6 and 5, right? I think this is before Benjamin's born, right? Like you can still, right? Like Abraham makes a great nation with just 1 son, right? Isaac makes a great nation with just 1 son. Like Jacob still has extra sons left over. And yet, like, he says to God exactly what Abraham should have, which is, God, you told me I was going to be a great nation. Like, how do I sacrifice my son? So I am like inclined towards that reading also. What I'm struck by it, and I want to echo what Daniel said, because this is also a text I've not seen before, and it's really beautiful, and I want to sit with it for a lot longer. But what I'm actually sitting with is less in some ways your conclusion, Jim, and more your process, like what you're opening us up to. Because I'm a really big believer that, you know what, I'm going to say something, and maybe people can disagree with me, but, so maybe I need to say it more in the I, right? But I don't think it's true only of me, right? I think, like, very often we see text or we get questions and we intuit what we think the right answer is, right? Like, it's not like we have a question and then we look to the Torah to give us the answer. It's that, right? Like, so, like, I think all of us are like, sacrificing your child is a bad thing. Like that's not something that we're like, maybe it really is a good thing. Like, I think we're all, right? So, like, the question is like, what is God doing here? But what's really interesting is, like, what is that process, right? And so, like, I'm with you. Like, I also think that this was at no point does God want Abraham to actually sacrifice his child. I also think that Abraham in some ways fails this test. And I think, like, we see it later. I think we see it with Sodom and Gomorrah. I think we also see it later with Jacob, right? Like, we see all these other things. What I think is interesting is that, like, Jim, like, what you said at the end of, like, studying the text through the lens of philosophers, which I think is interesting, because I think, like, I could draw the same conclusion utilizing, like, midrash and utilizing some, like, early rabbinic commentary. And so part of what I feel like I've really learned is, like, a little bit of sort of your process, which I'm really grateful for you opening up that door for us.
And who says the great rabbis of the Midrash were not philosophers? So I want to first of all, thank you. It's a beautiful teaching, and the comments are just additional adornments to the conversation. I want to go in a slightly different direction. Not surprisingly, I'm the guy who said many times in these conversations, and say many times to my community, that I'm the person who wants to suspend disbelief in order to allow for the flowering of faith, right? And I've quoted that often as the notion of second naivete, right? The ability to suspend this disbelief in order to allow for a text to speak to us in a deeper way. But I also want to say that there are moments in time which is exactly the opposite, right? That we have to suspend what it is that the text says on its face value at first blush in order to allow for the possibility that there is something far deeper that's here, that the dissonance that we feel, which Rabbi Bennett has laid out for us beautifully, and Levinas has laid out for us as well, we've all talked about here, is the ability to understand when you hold them and when you fold them. When is it time to suspend disbelief in order to allow for faith? And when does faith, when true believers actually get in the way, or true belief gets in the way of what's really there? And I think Levinas raises that for us, that we can easily be led astray by a text of this sort to believe that Avraham Avinu is the model for how we should behave. And you've all said it in slightly different fashions, but I think it's important, at least for me, to say it in this very unvarnished way. Avraham Avinu here becomes a model for us of how not to behave, how not to allow ourselves to be put in a position where we are making very simple decisions because nothing ever really is as it seems. And when we continue to study the Torah, not only as a bunch of words on the page, but really as an artistic depiction in words of a scenario that's being laid out in front of us. Think about all of the famous portrayals of the Akedah, right? If you think about all the various artists, and I don't know what's coming to your mind, it'd be interesting to hear what each of us would say. But if you think about fill in the blank, a particular artistic depiction, what's in that picture? What does the artist choose to show us? And what does the artist choose not to show us, right? Often it's the absence of something that appears in the text that somehow doesn't appear in the depiction, or the other way around. There's something in the depiction that doesn't appear in the text. And that's kind of a midrash. And so I want to say that whenever I read text, and as lovers of text, of people who are using text to animate, I'm not only looking for what is there, but what's missing. What sets me off, right, to feel certain kinds of ways when I read a text. I just want to give a contemporary example, which I know that others have probably had this experience as well. Right after 9/11, I was about to get on a plane again for the first time. I was living in New York at the time. I was getting on a plane for the first time after 9/11. And there was a person who was obviously a Muslim, and they had their prayer mat. And they pulled out their prayer mat to daven at the gate before we got on the plane, right? And as the person was taking out their mat to daven, you notice that people were migrating very quickly to the ticketing stand once again to see if they could change their ticket and get off the flight. And I remember that in reading this text and the way in which Rabbi Bennett has presented it, I felt this moment in time where I actually had to be the guy to step up first and actually get on that plane. That I had a moral obligation to step forward as a person, a faithful person in a kippah, who an hour earlier had been davening with my own talit and tefillin, right? Not a prayer mat, but in my own prayer modality, to step forward and say, I'm getting on this plane because I don't believe that every person is of faith is a person who wants to do harm, is going to take down this plane, is going to hijack something, going to crash this airplane, but rather faith is not a destructive tool, but faith is, of course, for us, the people of faith, right? Something that it will add love and beauty to the world. And I remember that experience as we were listening to this beautiful teaching from Levinas and reflecting on it, that we can't give up on it. So it is a discernment, right? That's, I think, the key part, at least for me, is becoming a lover of the text, of utilizing text, is to discern what text is the right text for any given moment in time, and which parshanut hamikra, right, in this case of the Torah, which commentary is the one that we need at this moment in time. We have a wonderful toolbox, and Rabbi Bennett pulled out one, right, that's so helpful for us. I think it would be a transgression to read the text as if the Almighty is asking for us to sacrifice our children. On the other hand, it would also be a transgression to not dig deeper, to understand that there still is the commanding voice. If you want to say the commanding voice of God, or the commanding voice of the tradition, the commanding voice of the prophets, there's a commanding voice that is still to be heard, that echoes throughout history and continues to echo. And at every moment in time, that voice may sound a little different. But in this day and age, as Rabbi Bennett has suggested, this Levinasian voice, I think, echoed through the beautiful voice of Rabbi Bennett, I think is one that we all need to hear. So thank you. It is a powerful text, and I promise that I will steal it and use it, borrow it and use it in a class as well. Yesher koach, beautifully done.
The greatest compliment. So why don't, I'm going to just jump off of this one, if I can just go next, because I think my text kind of builds off of, in many ways, some of this conversation, or I think this conversation kind of sets it up nicely. And the text that I brought, and Autumn, I think you have it in 2 slides, but the text that I brought is a text that might be familiar to many people. It's a pretty famous story that appears in the Talmud, and it's the story of Moshe in Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash. So I'll read some of it. Can we zoom in just a little? I just want to make sure people can see it. Maybe we can start the slideshow. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so we have this teaching from Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav, right? So Moshe is up high on high, right? So this Midrash is understanding that Moshe, right? What's happening? Moses goes up to the top of Mount Sinai. He goes up for 40 days. Like, what's Moses doing for these 40 days up on Mount Sinai? And so the Midrash is imagining that when Moses is up there, he sees God sitting and putting crowns on the letters, right? If you read the Torah scroll, you'll see that there's these adornments to the letters. And Moses says to God, ruler of the universe, who's forcing your hand, right? Meaning, like, just like, give me the Torah. Like, the people are waiting, right? Like, I came up here, I can be back down in a week. Why am I waiting for you? Right? So there's like this, what I love this story so much, right? There's this like beauty, this like tenderness, right? Of God, like very carefully, getting like this tiniest detail correct, right? And Moses is like, God, you're God. Like, if the crown wasn't there, no one would notice. Like, you get to decide if the crown is there or not. So, why are you doing this? And God answers and he says, there's a man who will appear at the end of several generations. His name is Akiva, the son of Joseph. And he's going to need these crowns because for each and every one of these marks, he's going to derive scores and scores of laws, right? Which is like, again, like amazing, right? That God is sort of saying, like, Moses, in the future, there's going to be someone and he's going to understand something from what I'm doing. And so Moses says, obviously, right? He's like, God, show it to me, right? I want to see this man. And so the Holy One says, turn around, and Moses turns around and he finds himself in the very back of Rabbi Akiva's classroom, right? The very famous Rabbi Akiva. And he goes and he sits in the back. And this is the part that's amazing, right? Moses has no idea what's going on, like no clue what's happening. And he becomes weak. He becomes disoriented, right? This is like, if Jim had done very much more of Levinas, I might start to feel like, right? Like when your head just starts to hurt, when you have, no, right? But I mean that, right? Like when there's brilliance in front of you and you're just like, I'm not smart enough for this. I know I've had that experience. Maybe nobody else here has. I'm willing to be vulnerable and say that, right? And
I'm having it right now as you're speaking.
Thank you. Right. So he becomes weak and disoriented. And then at one point in the class, one of the students kind of raises his hand and he says, Rebbe, what's your source for this? And Rabbi Akiva answers, it's a law of Moshe from Sinai, halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and Moses is relieved. So I want to like just sit with this for just like a minute, right? Because like this part is just, it's just so astounding to me, this whole element of it, right? Where like, to me, like this is part of how I think about Torah, right? That there is this tether, right? That like Torah ultimately, for me, like it has to be halacha l'Moshe miSinai, right? That there is something that connects us one to the next. And yet, even as we say, this is what was taught to Moses on Mount Sinai, Moses himself has no idea, right? And by the way, like the story itself, if we're going to really get meta on the layers, the story itself is happening in the rabbi's imagination. And so the rabbis themselves are saying, we know that what we are teaching, Moses would not understand. Like if Moses came down today and joined our discussion, Moses would not recognize this. I think about this. I don't remember if I referenced this at another time. A few years ago, one of the Jewish newspapers in New York, someone had said, this is like offensive, so apologies, but I'm quoting it in the name of this person, right? The person was like, Orthodoxy is the most legitimate branch of Judaism because if Moses came back, Moses would be most comfortable in Orthodoxy. And people were like, which part of like our English speaking, Yiddish speaking, Shtreimel wearing, like none of this would Moses understand at all, right? But the rabbis are saying like, we're not pretending, right? This guy was like, we're halacha l'Moshe miSinai, and the rest of us are like, no. Right, the rabbis are saying we know Moses would not understand at all what's happening. Let's just go to the next slide, because I think oftentimes the story, right, the story often like kind of ends there, and I think it's important that we actually take it to its conclusion, because otherwise it's unfair to it. Right, so Moses turns to God and he says, if you have someone like this, why are you giving the Torah through me? Like give the Torah to Akiva. He seems to be a much smarter guy. I can't understand what he's talking about. And God says, silence. This is what I've decided. And then Moses says, and this is where the story takes a heartbreaking turn. He says, Master of the universe, you showed me his teaching, now show me his reward. And God again says, turn around. And Moses turns around and he sees Rabbi Akiva's flesh being weighed out in the marketplace, right? Remember, Rabbi Akiva is very famously martyred by the Romans. And Moshe says, Master of the universe, this is the Torah and this is the reward. And God again says, silence, this is my decision. Okay, we can return to full screen now. This to me, I think like I sit with all of this, and I think this kind of goes back to some of what I was saying before to you, Jim, of like, right, like I think the Torah, right, part of this is like God and Moshe both recognizing like the Torah might become something that we didn't recognize, right? And by the way, God could say to Moses, I'm affixing these crowns because I want you to know that because of this crown, here are the scores and scores of laws you should understand. He doesn't, right? He doesn't explain it to Moses at all. Like, it's not clear if God intends it or God just kind of gets a kick out of the fact that Akiva is going to figure it out. Like, not totally clear from this story. And I think there's something beautiful in the fact that, like, for Torah to be this living document, it has to have the potential, right? It's like a child, right? Like you birth it and it goes out in the world, and like it can go in directions that you never expected for it, and you have to give it this freedom. And yet it's still like, this is what I was hearing kind of in you, Carney, right? Like there's a tether, right? It's not like a totally like, I'm going to take it and I'm just going to run amok with it. Like somehow, like for me, it always has to connect somehow to whatever I understand this, like halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And so for me, that doesn't preclude studying people like Levinas or right? Like it's saying like, and that's saying like, we all need to take it for our modern time. Akiva could understand laws that Moses couldn't understand, and we're going to understand Torah that Akiva couldn't understand. But I think that there is a necessity to still like honor that, right? Like part of saying halacha l'Moshe Sinai is always honoring. It's not saying like, well, we're smarter because we have these new things. It's saying like, we are the inheritors of this tradition, and we honor that where which we tied back to, even as we very much get to own it into our modern world.
Rory, I just think that's so beautiful, and thank you for bringing this beautiful Talmudic Midrashic text to us. I just want to add a thought. Whenever I've studied this text, to me, the prevailing lesson of this, which is also raises a deeply disturbing question for this text, which is, I read this text as really ultimately about humility. That Moshe is being told, right? Don't be so sure that you are so important. These crowns on the letters are there to symbolize that there will be other voices that will be added in future generations. Let me show you one of them. He shows them. But what's so disturbing about this lesson of humility is the end. And I'm curious to know how you handle the fact that with all the humility of knowing that Rabbi Akiva is going to come and he's going to teach the text, and I'm investing in him as much as I'm investing in you, Moses. By the way, he's going to get martyred and his flesh is going to be ripped off of his body in the marketplace. How do you resolve that punishment of Akiva as the reward, so to speak, for being humble enough to interpret Torah through your own lens and yet not to believe that yours is the end? What do you do with that?
First of all, I love your restating of all of that, and so thank you for that. I mean, I think it's a heartbreaking end. I don't think there is a simple answer to it, and to me, I think what's poignant is really right. There's an element in here where like the rabbis are willing to sort of like put words into God's mouth, right? They're willing to kind of play this role. They're willing to say like, we are interpreting Torah that God hasn't totally given. And they also are acknowledging that there are things that are beyond their understanding. Like, I think that's also part of their wrestling, right? Like, because to me, right, so this is, I always love when these stories, there's like what's happening in the story, and then there's like the author of the story, right? Because like, to me, it's not like, because I don't know that Moshe actually, like to my imagination, I'm more interested in like the rabbis telling this story, right? Like, because this is their narrative. And so to me, it's the rabbis wrestling with, on the one hand, like this humility, right? The rabbis, I think they're saying like, for our tradition to survive, we need to be able to branch out, and we need to be able to make it something new and modern. And we need to maintain this humility. And I think kind of part of that humility is saying there's parts of this that we're never going to be able to access. Like, we think that we took something and we made something beautiful, and we don't know why God chooses Moses, and we don't know why God is going to martyr Akiva. Like, not going like why he did, like, we don't know. And I think that's also part of this, is that there are things that we don't have, excuse me, that we don't have answers for. And I think the rabbis are sitting with that.
Or is it an attempt, I'm just curious, just to push it a little further, is it an attempt by those rabbis who wrote this story? Because, I don't think any of us really believe that Moses took this fantastical time travel journey to see Akiva. Is it really the rabbi saying, you are welcome to interpret Torah for yourself if you want, but do so at your own risk, because the consequences are the flesh might be torn off of your body if you're wrong. I don't know. Is that what it's saying? I'm just curious.
I never thought of it this way, but I'm really struck by the way that the ending roots us in this world, right? Because of course we live in a world where things like the greatest of us being martyred is reality. right? I mean, we look out and you can't exist as a human being without understanding that awful things happen to good people and so on and so forth. And so it just struck me that this is such a mythic text, right? I mean, right, this imagination, this time travel, and for all of that, the ending roots it in this world, in reality, that this is a lesson that exists right here in our lives when we look around, in our personally, in our families, in our politics, in our, yeah.
I just want to make sure not to leave us in that dark place, to say that, when we write the midrash of this era, or each of us, and maybe we'll take it personally, when I write, I'll use I statement, when I write the story of my rabbinate, and I'm making sense of those crowns on the letters of Torah, I really hope that the end is not the peeling of my flesh from my body, right? I really hope and pray that there's another ending here that's potentially available to us in this era. We have to think about the rabbis talking about their zitzim Laban, right? They're writing at a time and a place when their reality was the reward, the sachar for engagement in Torah was, the flesh being, potentially the flesh being peeled from their body. But if each of us were to talk about what is the great sachar, what's the great reward that we have received from being teachers of Torah and innovators of Torah, right? So I just think about what Rabbi Bennett just taught a moment ago from Levinas, right? What gift has he given now to all of us, the 55 people who are with us here, the additional people going to watch this recording, right? The gift that Levinas gave us, which Rabbi Bennett interpreted, which we are now giving to the world. And I hope and pray that the end is not that our flesh will be peeled from our bodies, but rather what people will talk about, I learned something from this group of 4 Hartman rabbis that enabled me to look at the story and the narrative of the Akedat Yitzchak in a new way. And so when we talk about the teaching of Torah and its meaning and its consequence, and maybe its existential benefit to each of us as teachers of Torah, it is that we have the ability, as you talked about humility, but what about the great zechut? What about the great merit to teach Torah in whatever way we see fit? Right, so of course we could teach it in the direction, and we're influenced by our time and our place. We could talk about a Torah that leads us in the direction of sadness and remorse, and all this work that we did for whatever number of years we've been in the rabbinate, and it ends up, not being. And we're living in this era, right, the great resignation era. But none of us are resigning. In fact, we're not turning to the place of resignation. We are teaching Torah here with optimism and looking forward, and embracing what it is that's available to us, and saying that we have a text that's malleable, that's flexible. I always talk about Torah as tofu, right? We can add whatever flavor we want, and it'll take on the flavor. And so what a great merit that we've got. So yes, this was the reality of Rabbi Akiva. Yes, there is something very humbling about it. It could be that you spend your whole life and it end up being the flesh torn from your body. On the other hand, I was talking about this earlier today. So, there's nothing here that I'm going to say that people don't know. There was, all this rumor about I was leaving St. Louis, right? In the end, I thought about, why am I staying in St. Louis and not leaving St. Louis? Because I remember when Rabbi Lipnik, Zichron Lechav, blessed memory, had his funeral, and 1,000 people sat enraptured for 6 hours. And you know what it was about? It was about 58 years of a relationship with people. All of us who've had deep, deep, long relationships, right, know that those are the relationships that make the most sense to us, are the ones that are deepest within us. And by the way, it doesn't have to be in one location. You can have them in multiple locations, but deep, deep, deep relationships that are cultivated over the course of time. And we have that deep, deep, deep relationship with Torah over the course of time. And sometimes it will go dark, but sometimes it will be so enlivening and uplifting, and even in the moments when we feel like our flesh is being ripped from our body, we'll also feel as if we have made tremendous sacrifices for the sake of something greater than ourselves. So as I read this text, I find it very, very personal, and I'm sure that others can reflect on that. The great victories is we get tired, we get beaten down. There are moments when things don't go our way, right? But there are also moments, and all of us could talk about those moments when Torah has animated our lives, and the Torah that we shared with people has animated their lives. Think about all of the couples that we have counseled, all the individuals we've helped make meaning of moments in time, how Torah has been able to help those people get through the difficult and dark times of their life, and also take celebrations and take them from here to here. Because Torah and Judaism and the way of life that we're all promulgating, each in our own way, has been beneficial to people and has made a huge difference. So it's not just the skin being peeled from our flesh. It is the notion that those katarim, those crowns, are there, and we can do tremendously positive things with those crowns as well.
So maybe I'll jump in with my text. I really resonated with what you just said, Carney. In particular, this sort of notion that Torah is a conversation through time. Right? I'm putting words into your mouth, or maybe I'm putting my words out there. But that's very much how I relate to Torah. I do not relate to Torah as being divine revelation. I relate to Torah as being the ancient tribal stories of our people, and one link in a long chain of discussion through time, through space, through the future, through the past, of what it means to be human in the most profound ways, and what it means to live a good life. Right. And in those senses, I don't think the big picture of what it means to be a sibling or a parent or a friend or a human being in a problematic world has really changed in the biggest questions. From today to the beginnings of the sacred conversation we call Torah. So Autumn, if you can throw up my text, there's an old joke I feel like I should start with here, which is how many Hartman Rabbis does it take to change a light bulb? And of course, the answer is 4. 1 to change the light bulb, 1 to hold the ladder, and 2 to do chavruta on the oven of Achnai, which is the text we're going to study here. So I love this text. I teach this text all the time. There's lots of texts I call my favorite text, but this is probably my favorite text. So we find this in the Talmud in Bava Metzia. There's this discussion beforehand about an innovation. Rabbi Eliezer comes up with this idea of creating an oven that cannot acquire impurity by pre-breaking it. Not really important to us, but that's what the debate is. It's really about a technological innovation that Rabbi Eliezer suggests here that is immediately rejected by the rabbis here. So this is known as the oven of Achnai. The sages taught on that day, when they discussed the matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support this opinion, but the rabbis did not accept the explanation from him, right? He makes logical sense. If you're just going by logic, Rabbi Eliezer's position should win the day. So failing logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halakha of Jewish law is in accordance with my opinion, the carob tree will prove it. So the carob tree is uprooted and they start dancing around and jumping back and forth. And then I feel like this says a lot about the Talmud. Then we get into a debate whether, did they actually jump 100 cubits or 400 cubits, right? Not can carob trees dance, but how far do they actually dance? The rabbis look back at them and they say, like, what do carob trees know about halakha? Like, you can't prove anything from a carob tree. So Rabbi Eliezer looks at them and says, if it's in accordance with my opinion, let the streams prove it. And the streams begin to run backwards. And of course, the rabbis look back at him and say, yeah, miracles, but what do streams know about halakha? So this keeps going on. Rabbi Eliezer says, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, let the walls of the study prove it. And we're told that the walls of the study began to lean in and they were going to collapse on them. But in deference to Rabbi Yehoshua and in the great wisdom inside, they only paused and didn't fully collapse. You get the sense that people would walk by this house and be, that's the place. That's the leaning tower of rabbis. So finally, right, like he's tried logic, he's tried miracles, he's tried all of these things. So who can you appeal to? Where can you appeal? And the answer is God. So Rabbi Eliezer says, if I am right, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. And we're told a divine voice emerges from heaven and says, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer? The halakha is in accordance with his opinion in every place he expresses an opinion. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is not written in heaven. He actually quotes Torah out of context back at God, right? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, and we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote in Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline, which is to say that God jumps in and says that Rabbi Eliezer is correct, and the rabbis look back at God and say, like, God, what do you know about halakha? What do you know about Jewish law here? Right? What standing do you have in this court? And finally, there's the ending, which really makes this a subversive text, a deeply subversive text. Rabbi Natan encounters Elijah the prophet, just kind of runs into him. I always kind of imagine it's at a tavern and they're sitting there and they're asking each other, like, what do you do for a living, right? And so he looks at Elijah and he says, what did the Holy Blessed One do at that time when Rabbi Yehoshua said this, right? Said, God, you have no standing here. And God responds, my children have triumphed over me my children have triumphed over me, except that word triumphed can also be read as expanded in the Aramaic. So you can turn this off, Autumn. Thank you. I love this text. I adore this text because I think it makes the point that the point of Torah is the human process that it starts. I always like the image of Torah as a pearl, with like the initial text being that grain of sand, the irritant, and all of these layers being formed around it over time, right? The layers that we add to Torah, the links in this chain. And right, like chas v'shalom, God forbid that we would cut open a pearl to get back to the grain of sand. Right, that's not where the value or the beauty of a pearl is. So this very much, as soon as you said we were talking about what text describes your Torah, this text describes my relationship to Torah as very much a human process, a human conversation. Yeah, I would love to hear some of your other thoughts on this. I know we all adore this text in our own ways too.
Daniel, I thank you for bringing this, because I love this text so much, and like hearing it in your voice, it was suddenly a brand new text again, which like it sounds cliche and it really was. But one of the things that jumped out at me, which I don't think I've noticed before until your reading of it, was the way that like Rabbi Eliezer was willing to disrupt nature for his argument, and I'm like kind of sitting with that. First of all, I shouldn't say first of all, like let me finish my fun thought, right? Like I'm sitting with kind of like that dynamic of like that also becomes problematic, right? Like the person who's like so committed to being right? Because like streams going backwards are actually not good for the environment. And like I really, it hit me. I mean, by the way, carob trees uprooting, but it really hit me in the walls collapsing, right? Because like he was willing to kill everyone in that room, right? Like if Rabbi Joshua had not stood up, right? I love that the text is like the walls weren't sure if they should, like they had to be respectful to Rabbi Eliezer, but respectful to Rabbi, like I love that. But it means that Rabbi Eliezer was like, I'm going to prove my point, and I don't care if we all get crushed in the process because I'm right. Yeah. And that's like, that becomes also dangerous, right? And so I think there's like an element to this text that I've always taken of like, it's not in heaven, like it's up for us to decide, but there's also like, there's not one right answer that you can burn everything down for. Like this is right, because like if you kill everyone in the process of being right, you're wrong. Like you're just fundamentally wrong. Even if your logic was sound, you're wrong.
Yeah, I think the part about Rabbi Eliezer giving all the answers possible in the world is rabbinic humor here, right? It's what he believes all the right or possible answers are. And by the way, the notion of nitzchuni banai nitzchuni, how did you interpret it, Daniel, again? It's my children have overcome me. What did you say?
Triumphed and expanded. That's Barry Kogan's teaching.
Yeah, I love that. But I want to say nitzchuni also has netzach, which means eternity. My children have provided eternity for this process, which Rabbi Eliezer was trying to prove is a limited process. So what ends up happening here is the expansion of Torah by virtue of the fact that the rabbis are saying, listen, you are brilliant. You're right. You know what? You would get an A in every course that you took, and you have dotted all the I's and crossed the T's. And nonetheless, v'afal pi, there's still more that needs to be done. And that's why the process continues. That's why four folks are sitting here on this conversation, still talking about the oven of Achnai, even though we've talked about it ad nauseum in every cohort of Hartman, and every Hartman meeting cannot start without somebody teaching the oven of Achnai, because in the end it says that we have netzach. We are given eternity and perpetuity by virtue of the fact that we continue to engage in a process which is never ending. It's asymptotal striving, right? We're just going forward. The lines are getting closer and closer, but we'll never meet because there's more to do.
Yes, and I just want to make sure we at least acknowledge that not all of our fellow Jews or rabbis in the world would agree with that. I think I've shared this with you all before. I studied this text once to my shock and awe with somebody who came out of the very, very strict halachic, Haredi background, actually, who said to me when I said, look, exactly, I didn't say it nearly as eloquently as Daniel or you, Carney, just said it, but nonetheless, I said, this justifies reform, conservative, non-Orthodox, interpretative encounter with halakha. And this rabbi looked at me and said, "You're completely wrong." Because what these rabbis all shared was they were all interpreting halakha as the rabbinic authorities, and the random voice of anybody, ad eternity, ad nauseum, that is not how they read this text. And I think we should proudly stand our ground and say, for us, for those of us who studied Hartman, those of us who are non-Orthodox, or even if we call ourselves Orthodox, who are non-literalists, who are open to the plethora of interpretations of Torah, this text says even God stands aside and allows human interpretation of Torah. And I just want to say that is not universally agreed upon.
And then, by the way, I will just say that makes me sad more than anything else, because tether it back, right? It's tethered to the conversation that we had earlier, right, with Rory's commentary about Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe Rabbeinu comes back into the Beit Midrash. He doesn't even know what's going on, but at least he hears, right? Halakha Moshe Misinai. He knows that I haven't been forgotten, right? Along the way, the best that we can hope for, the best that we can hope for in our families, the best that we can hope for in our communities, in our congregations, right? The best that we can hope for is that we've made some contribution to a process, not the final word. In fact, I would never want the final word. I would not want the Judaism that I am practicing today to be the Judaism that my children are practicing exclusively. Would I like them to say, "Oh, Zeta Carney once upon a time told us that this is important and I'm doing it"? I would want them to take it to a new level, to a new place, at least for me. And as long as it somehow or another feels tethered, I love that term, Rory, tethered to some source, then I feel like we're continuing the process. And that for me feels very, very exciting. And also it's very humbling, because all I'm doing is talking about a slice of a moment in time, right? We could live for 120 years and we will simply be a little blink in the eye from a God's eye view of what's happening in history. And so we've made our contribution at this moment in time. By the way, for me, Jim, at least, that gives me a great sense of humility, right? Because when I'm making a determination, let's say a halakhic determination, I'm sure each of us feels the same way, right? We're going to decide what custom is going to be for our particular congregation, or what we're going to call the halakha for our moment in time. Don't we understand that somebody could come after us? The person who's going to take the job after me may see it in a different kind of way based on texts of this sort and say, look, we're going to do it a new way. I still remember Rabbi Lipnick saying to me when I came to him with a crazy idea, and I looked at him sort of sheepishly, and he said, "But young man, you should know that even the new math has become old." Right? So there's something about what we're innovating. But someday somebody will say, "Oh, that's not such a big deal. You want to hear innovation? I'm going to give you innovation."
So I want to challenge you for a moment.
Yeah.
Tethered to Torah, tethered to tradition, to me, sounds limiting. And it's like anchored, it's like held in place. And I just wonder whether we can find a better, newer metaphor that allows us to return, Rabbi Ben Bagbag, when he says, turn it over and over and over, to return, not to forget. I was with you at not forget. I was with you, remember. I was with you, honor. But I'm not sure I'm with you when we say tethered, because I'm afraid if you tether a boat, it's never going to go anywhere. It's just,
you're so right. But let's maybe brainstorm what would be a better term. I don't know, valence, influence, somehow or another. It colors us. It gives us a shade. It gives us, I don't know what the right terminology is. It has some hold on me. I don't feel so bound to it that I can't break free from it, but I feel influenced by it. Maybe for Rory it's different. Maybe she really meant tethered. I don't want to speak for her, but I think you're 100% right that there's something I want it in my consciousness. I always say I love people who come to me and they're apikorsin. You know why? Because an apikors knows the whole Torah, right? In order to be the reimaginer of paradigms, you have to understand what the paradigm is. You have to know what you're breaking. And by the way, I think that's actually one of the things that at least I don't use the term tethers me, right? Gives me a little bit of humility and says, I want to stay close to this because for 3,000, 4,000 years, this has meant something to people. And before I smash it, all right, before I smash this idol, knowing that it's an idol, knowing that it had a utility for a moment in time, I want to know, what am I replacing it with? And maybe replacing is with just the open search, but sometimes I already have something in mind for the next iteration that at least give people some mooring, and not make people feel lost. My dad often says this to me. He says, before you kind of imagine that you're going to shift something, right? You're going to do a paradigm shift, which we all love to talk about paradigm shift. What are you shifting to? What are you shifting to? Maybe it's the open search, but maybe we have something else in mind. Maybe a little bit more judicious about the shift. And maybe that sort of exemplifies why I find a home in the conservative movement most of the time, or at least some of the time.
So I do want to just respond to say I do like the word tether. Like, to me, I mean, I think in my mind, though, in the imagery, it's a question of like, how much slack do we have? Like, I don't see it as an anchor that's keeping me put. I see it as there is something that's at the core, and I have, a rope, and it's kind of elastic, right? But like, I always keep coming back, and it keeps pulling me back. And sometimes I'm closer to it, and sometimes I step far away. And so I think for me, like, there's a lot of slack on it. But I also wrestle with the fact that I do think that there is a point where we can veer off. Like, I think there's a lot of room. I think that there's a lot of room for interpretation. Like, I think that's part of the beauty of Torah. And also, I mean, people have quoted, and look, I want to recognize, like, that's also their interpretation. I don't have an authority to tell someone, but like, people have quoted Torah to me that I also think is wrong, right? Like, if somebody was going to quote Akedat Yitzhak to say God wants child sacrifice, like, I would say that is, like, to me, like, that's the importance of the tether. Is like, there's a point in which, like, someone can veer off that I'd be like, I'm no, like, that I would feel untethered by it. Right. I've had the privilege of actually teaching, like, the text that I've taught it to Christians as a way of kind of helping them understand some of the way that Jews study Torah. And it's always funny because whenever I get to the part where Moses says, like, who is this man? And God says, his name's Akiva, the son of Joseph. There will always be someone who's like, oh, that's like a hint to Jesus, right? And I'm like, no, it's not, right? They're like, son of Joseph. And I'm like, right? Like, for me, like, there is a point where I'm like, nope, that went too far. And maybe that's part of, like, me sitting in the Orthodox circle, right? But like, I do think that there's a part. And so for me, like, how do I measure if we're open to multiple interpretations? Like, how do I measure if this interpretation feels true? To me, it's like the pull on the tether, right? Like, if I'm no longer attached, then I've gone astray. And I do think that it's important to still come back to a core element of it.
Beautiful, beautiful. We have 12 minutes in which to cover the Zohar. So I know that, for most of you that's easy going, but I'm going to try to teach a little bit of the Zohar. And the question that we were asking ourselves, right, is about the connection to Torah. How does Torah animate our lives, our rabbinates, the work that we do in the world? And I wanted to take it from the perspective of being lovers of Torah, right? How can we become lovers of Torah? And this is a section of the Zohar that some of you may be familiar with and others you may be not familiar with. And I apologize for the translation because it's mine and it's probably a bit fakakt, which means that I did my best to try to make some sense of it, okay? But the Zohar, of course, attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, but likely not available till much later. It's interesting, I think in the end, we probably went through the text in historical fashion, unless you insert the Zohar as being the words of Shimon Bar Yochai, and then we would have put it maybe before some of the Talmudic texts that we looked at. But one way or another, I think it's in a good place where we have it right now. And Moses de Leon more so into the Middle Ages or early Middle Ages. So a parable. To what can this be compared? I.e. the nature and study of Torah. That's how I got to this particular text, remembering it, right? To a beautiful princess, lovely in every way, and secreted away deeply within her castle, right? You can just imagine, this sort of sounds like a Disney movie, right? She has a lover unknown to anyone. He is hidden too. That is the lover, that is us, right? The people who are trying to access this beautiful Torah. Because of his love for her, he passes constantly by the palace gates, lifting his eyes to cast a glimpse of her, right? So he's trying to see the lover. He's trying to see the beautiful princess who is secreted away in some kind of upper chamber at the top of a minaret. I get the kind of image, and he can't access her. And he's trying the lover to catch a glimpse. What does she do? What does the lover do who's up high, maybe in her little secreted place that she's in? Maybe she's somehow a prisoner. I'm not sure. What does she do? She opens a small window in the minaret where she is secluded. She reveals her face to her lover, and then she quickly withdraws, hiding herself. By the way, at least for me, this is a great tease, right? There's an element here of a tease. She doesn't just leave the window open somehow or another. Maybe she's not allowed to show herself fully, but somehow or another, there is this game, this peekaboo that's going on with Torah. She reveals her face to her lover and then quickly withdraws, hiding herself. Only the lover sees her, and all that is within him flows towards her. Cheshek, right? She is desirous of being connected. He is desirous of being connected to her. But he knows that it is only out of love for him that she revealed herself, even for a moment, to awaken her love. So on some level, Torah, right, who is the secreted away, reveals herself a little bit to us, even though it's maybe not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to kind of be this game where we're not able to fully see or even have the peekaboo. So it is with the word of Torah. The Torah reveals herself to no one except her lover, for she knows that he who is wise of heart hovers by the gate each day. For me, this might be maybe the most important line of this entire text, and maybe the most important line for me in terms of how Torah animates my life. I'm the lover who's hovering to catch a little glimpse of the insight of Torah that can add meaning and consequence to my life. What does she do? She reveals her face to him from the castle and beckons him with a hint, right? The more that I hover, the more that I spend time, the more that I engage in the study of Torah or attempting to pierce through the experience of gaining entree to Torah, she gives me a little bit more, right? Shows me a little bit more. It's sort of like the dance of seven veils kind of concept. She begins to reveal herself, right? His heart and his soul, his whole being flows out towards her. That is why the Torah reveals and conceals herself, right? At moments, Torah appears to be very open, reveals and conceals. By the way, that's badekin, right? At a wedding, it's badekin. It is a double entendre. You are revealing and concealing all at the same time, right? You place the veil over the bride. You conceal her outer beauty so that what? So you can see with the mind's eye the inner beauty. Come and see, this is the way of Torah. At first, when she begins to reveal herself, she beckons with a hint. If it should say he understands, is good. If he does not, she sends him a message calling him fool. By the way, this fool that is calling him, it's a tease, isn't it? Calling him, oh, you're such a fool, right? It isn't that the Torah is saying you're a fool, but rather, it's fool. You're foolish if you're thinking you understand me now simply, or you understand what it is that I'm really all about. The Torah tells the messenger, say to the fool to come closer so I can converse with him, as is written, who is the fool without a heart? Have him turn in here. In other words, turn ever more towards me. This is from Proverbs, of course. He approaches, she begins to converse. Sorry, I've got to move it down here. She begins to converse with him, and from behind a curtain, she has drawn words he cannot understand until he reflects a little at a time. This is drasha, one level of understanding, the Zohar is saying. Then he speaks with him through a veil, words of allegory. This is Haggadah, another level of understanding. Once he has become accustomed to her, she reveals her face to face, right? She tells him all her hidden secrets, all the hidden ways since primordial days that are hidden in her heart. Now he is a perfect human being, a husband of the Torah, Baal, right? Master, husband of the Torah, a master of the house. All her secrets she has revealed to him, holding back nothing, concealing nothing. She says to him, did you see the word, the hint with which I first beckoned you? So many secrets there, this one and that one. Now he sees that nothing should be added to those words and nothing taken away. Now the pshat of the verse, just like it is, not even a single letter should be added or deleted. And so human beings must become aware and they must pursue the Torah to become her lovers. I know the ending part is a little bit challenging, maybe for us, and I'd love to hear people reflect on it, but at least from my perspective, I often go back to the pshat of the Torah, not the pshat as understood earlier by some of the comments that we saw. Well, it says that God accepted, God was happy with what Avraham Avinu did. That's not what we mean, but rather that it's there, it's waiting to be revealed. It is concealed right now. What the deeper tradition is. And I want to add this, something that I said back to, I think, Bob, who asked the question earlier. To understand Akedat Yitzchak, which is where we started with Rabbi Bennett, and to think that the story is that Avraham Avinu was willing to sacrifice Yitzchak means that that's what God wanted, is to read the Torah without a necessary rabbinic lens. And we rabbinic Jews never read Torah without a rabbinic lens. We always read Torah through the lens of Midrash. And I'll quote my great teacher, Rabbi Steinsaltz, Zichrono Livracha, who used to say, why did God give people two hands? And the answer, one hand to read the text and one hand to read the commentary. We rabbinic Jews are not Jews who read the text absent the commentary of the tradition that's been handed down midor ledor. And to read the text qua text, to see it simply as pshat, is to misunderstand what pshat is. Pshat is not a simple understanding of the text as written. It is not some kind of absolutely literally what it says is what it means. It's not that. To read the pshat is to read the tradition, to read the Torah with the ongoing revelatory process of insights that are provided to us through the great rabbis, all the way down into our own age, including, of course, the great teacher of Torah, Levinas, who we started this session with today through the words of Rabbi Bennett. So for me, as asked about what animates this process, first of all, I'm a person who loves these kinds of stories. This Zoharic story is sort of like the story of my life, right? The peeking, the revealing, and the concealing, the drama, the intrigue, and of course, the romance that comes as one begins to draw ever closer to something that one loves so deeply, and waking up the next morning and doing the whole process over again and understanding something anew than one missed the time before, and suddenly saying, aha, you, beautiful Torah, are revealing to me something that I had never understood before. And I thank you for the opportunity to see that, to experience that, and to feel that. So that's my offering for today from the Zohar. I try to do it in under 12 minutes. Reactions?
Beautiful, just beautifully inspiring. Thank you for reminding us of this Zoharic text, which is so powerful. And also, I'll just say thank you all. You know, in the midst of our crazy lives, all of our crazy lives, not just the four of us, but all of us, just having an hour and 14 minutes together to study Torah the way we've done it today is an incredible gift. And it's a reminder to us of that love affair that you just shared with us from the Zohar. And I just loved being with you guys again.
Let's do it again.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to echo, thank you, Carney, for bringing us back to the love, right? Like that, because I do think that that's what needs to animate us, right? Like that's what needs to drive. And I think, you know, some of the comments that were coming through also in the chat, people were talking about, right? Like when is the debate over kinds of interpretations divisive and how do we go, right? And I think like, to me, it's always like, what is it that's driving us, right? Like, and this goes back also to me for Daniel's text, right? Like if what's driving Rabbi Eliezer is like to be right, then it's destructive, right? But if what's driving you forward is like this love affair, right? Like we just, right? It's this deep, deep passion. Then that becomes expansive. And I'm so glad that you're ending us on a note of love.
Yeah, I'll just add, remember that in lovemaking, we forget where we end and the other person begins, right? And we begin and the other person ends, right? That is the intertwining and the wrestling that happens in this great love affair. And so in some ways, I feel like we've been lovers with one another because it was amazing how all this stuff sort of got mashed together and became very beautiful, and we could use the pieces. Now, again, we sort of knew where each of us were going, and we all kind of knew some of the text from before, right? But I was amazed at how much each of the comments and each of the texts amplified ideas that each of us have. Rabbi Bogart, I just want to make sure you have the last word, maybe the only time in your career, so go.
No, it was a treat to be with you. This is such a nourishing, personally nourishing hour for me, hour 15 minutes when we do this, and just grateful for the three of you for these relationships and yeah, for what you all add to the St. Louis Jewish community. Really, really, really a lot of gratitude. Thank you.
Toda rabba to everybody.
And thanks to Autumn.
Big thank you to Autumn for producing.
I, at the risk, I'm going to let Daniel have the last word of the teaching, but I'm going to just say like one final word, which is that as we're closing out the year, I'm saying this without checking with anyone first, but I think you'll all be okay with this. No, but as we end off the year, I know that all of us work for organizations that are reliant on donations, and we're all, some of you might have different fiscal years, but I just want to say that I know we're all incredibly grateful to each of our institutions for supporting us through our study at Hartman and our continued study with Hartman. Obviously we're love being able to put on programs like this. And I know so many of you appreciate it. And so just want to say, right, this is very much a deep collaborative effort. And if you feel so moved, I know all of our organizations, obviously we all benefit from huge donations, but even a small amount just is indicative to our leadership that you appreciate the work that is happening in the community. And so I just want to put in a plug. We're grateful. We're grateful for all of your spiritual and emotional support. And I know that we also are grateful for all of the ways that you show support in helping us to continue doing this work. So thank you.
That was smooth.
That was good,
really
Rory.
smooth, Rory. Well done. Well done. I think I'm going to make a donation to each of your organizations now.
So related, who of y'all are going to Hartman this summer? Are you all coming?
Wishful
I'll be there.
thinking right now, hoping.
Well, you
definitely
need
going to
go.
Israel.
By the way, we're done. I know you can all still hear us, but I'm okay with the chit chat, but we are done with the program. Yeah, Daniel, you need to go because my kid is